Moscow time, and it's my great honor to welcome all of you. And it's a great project that we do together with Institute of Technology and Anthropology. And we welcome everybody who decided to join us here on Nizhny Novgorod State University, Lobachevsky University. We welcome everybody and our colleagues from Moscow, and definitely we are so grateful to see Professor Emeritus of New Mexico State University, Andew Wiget, who has decided to join us and to talk about very topical, I think, subject, because today we are going to talk about American Indians. And in Russia, we do not know too much about American Indians. Yes, in previous years, based on different movies, we have created several stereotypes about American Indians. And those stereotypes sometimes are not very helpful in order to get a real picture of American society. We know now, based on millions of reports from United States of America, how divided is American society today, but professionals know that it's not unusual situation for American society. This is partly might be considered as the key characteristic of American society, but American society, being very often divided, is able to survive and develop uh, economically very well. So it's a good time to have a professional discussion on American Indians, cultures, emotion, and we are really welcome Professor Andew Wiget. We have about 20 participants. Language is English, and as far as I understand, we have 50 minutes of lecture, and then Professor Wiget will take some questions from audience. So screen is yours. Now we can say that.
Thank you very much. Can you all hear me well? Can you hear me well?
Yes, sure.
Okay.
Yes, everything is okay.
Let me begin then. I call this lecture Cultures in Motion because I want to emphasize the dynamic nature of cultural change over a very long period of time, and the dramatic changes, especially in the past 300 years. But just as a bit of an overview, there are about 5.5 million Americans who identify themselves entirely or in part as native. We have, simply statistically, 574 federally recognized Indian reservations, and altogether they account for about 2.5% of the United States land. The largest reservation, the Navajo Reservation, is about 80% the size of Ireland in land area, and the Navajo Nation has 175,000 people. The smallest reservation is a half of a hectare in California. 17 people identify with that reservation. Let's begin at the beginning and ask ourselves, who are these people, how they got here, and why? And how much can we know and how do we know it? Just very briefly. So when I was a graduate student, sometime in the last century, the original paradigm was that people came across this Bering land bridge, as you know, and moved through an ice-free corridor and then entered what is now the continental United States somewhere around 10,000 years ago. This is called the Clovis paradigm because a Clovis spear point was found embedded in the rib of a mammoth, dated to about 8,000 BCE. Later, that paradigm was revised in terms of three migrations, a major one consisting basically of a group that was the forebears of most American Indians, North and South America, and then a second group, the antecedents of the Diné people of northern Athabasca, and then Navajos and Apaches, and finally somewhere around 3,000 or 4,000 BC, Inuit and other northern Arctic peoples. Still coming in through a land corridor. Most recently, this has been challenged, and people have argued that there was sufficient expertise and exposure of land and refugia along the Pacific coast, that this was the main migratory route into the Western Hemisphere, and it was certainly preceded the Clovis era. The breakthrough came with the discovery of a site in Monteverde, Chile, that has been very accurately dated and assessed to nearly 15,000 BC. So the current state of play is that we now think of two routes of entry into North America, into the Western Hemisphere. But we are pushing back the dates all the time. Not only do we have Monteverde, which has now been dated back to 18,000 years before the present, but recently discovered in central Mexico a cave with stone tools. No DNA, no human remains, dated to 26,000 years before present. That's incredibly huge. If we're thinking about who these people are, there are DNA analyses, but the DNA records are changing all the time. The interpretations are changing all the time, but they show clear connections in any case to Siberian peoples, and in the case of one group, to Siberian peoples very, very closely related, Kets, Selkups, and Northern Altaians. But that's a story for question, different later. The real question is, when these people came over, whoever they were, more than 10,000 years ago, what did they carry in their heads, as well as what did they carry on their backs? What kind of knowledge did they have? What kind of skills did they bring? What patterns for living? We see many parallels between the old world and the new world. These have been pointed out, the parallels between Buryat houses and Navajo hogans, the wide circumpolar distribution of bear ceremonialism, all sorts of possibilities. Establishing what was actually brought over in their heads is quite a different thing. But if we develop a kind of a timeline, we see that native North America, and I will focus on North America, not on South America. There's a limit to what I have been prepared to speak with some confidence about. But in terms of native North America, these earliest colonizers, we call them Paleo Indians, were big game hunters who worked principally with the atlatl, the throwing dart, hunting and spears, hunting big game, whether bison or mammoths. And they were succeeded at the beginning of the Holocene period, which is a period of rapid warming, by a number of very local adaptations, different subsistence types, depending on whether they were in the more tropical and semi-tropical warm southeast, or the desert southwest, or the wooded north. And we call that period the Archaic. It lasted for a very, very long time. until in the, we can speak here more confidently of the eastern part of the United States, a woodland period emerges in which people begin to practice some agriculture, some trade, and settle in villages, which eventually lead to this Mississippian formation, which we'll talk about in a bit, which was very, very highly developed and complex culture. That brings us up to the proto-historic period, which is the name we give to that period just before colonization, which is in the memory of oral history and in the earliest documentation. Basically, say 15th, 16th, 17th centuries. And then we come into the historic period where we have not only oral tradition, but we have documentary records by colonial powers. If we take a look at the language families in North America, it's very striking that north of the Canadian Shield, this is the, it's called the Canadian Shield, this is the bedrock granite that was exposed by the withdrawal of the glaciers. And this is really the area of the taiga. North of that, we see very few major language families. But if we go to the more temperate, warmer climates to the south, we see a huge number of language families. And so we see already that the cultural and linguistic adaptation corresponded to the various ecological niches. And where there was more variety of ecology, we had possibility for more variety in cultural formations. There's a problem with all of these maps, of course, and anybody who's done any work in anthropology knows there's a problem with maps. The locations reflect the people where they were at the time when they were contacted, not the archaeological time. They're usually based on a single criteria, in this case, language family. And the boundaries, you know, when you draw maps, you draw very sharp lines, but we know that in fact there's a lot of blurriness, a lot of overlap, a lot of indistinct boundaries here. The same thing goes with the idea of tribe. If we look at this map of California, we see many different tribes supposedly occupying California at different places. But of course, all of this depends on what we call a tribe. And it's very common today to hear people talk about Indian tribes and Native American tribes, and Indian people themselves will use this language. But from an anthropological point of view, a tribe is an operational definition. By that, it means something that we use as part of a discussion. It does not necessarily reflect a specific kind of phenomenon on the ground. So you have to be very careful when you talk about a tribe. A brilliant anthropologist in 1975, Morton Fried, published a book called The Notion of Tribe, which demonstrated that almost no matter which American Indian tribe you identified, whether you were talking about them genetically, there was a high rate of intermarriage. If you were talking about language, many tribes were at least bilingual, many were trilingual. There was shared ritual culture, shared material culture, sometimes shared political leadership, even shared territory and resources, so that with all of this overlap, one has to be very, very careful not to fixate on the notion of tribe. Fried went so far as to say tribes are not an elemental form of social organization at all. They're actually a secondary social formation that results from the way in which bands of families responded to colonial or external pressures. And if that sounds a lot like the notion of ethnic boundaries, That's exactly where anthropology tends to be going today, and talking about Indian peoples. We talk about them as peoples, we talk about them as ethnic groups. We don't invest too much in the idea of tribe as some kind of fixed social reality. So before colonization, this was something that I prepared a while back in talking to other group, but it's really interesting to look at the difference between Native Americans and Native Siberians. So Native Americans basically entered a vastly more varied environment, which led to more very traditional economies. This was not true in Siberia. There were many, many diverse peoples, a lot of very local and distinct adaptations. There was, in many places, a very, very high population density, which it never obtained anywhere really in Siberia, the far north or the far east. And probably the biggest difference are the last two. That is, in Siberia, there was regular contact with Chinese and Indo-Iranian, Turkic, Mongolic influences, with exposure to Eurasian diseases, and the adoption of useful technologies like metal smithing, working with chorny metal and so forth. None of this was common in North America. There was no wheel, there was no metal smithing. This made a big difference. So did the lack of exposure and developing immunity to many diseases. So the Archaic period, which is this long period from approximately 8000 BC up to, depends on where you are, but let's say 500 AD, was a period that was characterized almost everywhere by big game hunting and small family settlements. But what we start to see in the Valley of Mexico and elsewhere is the emergence of agriculture. So we see squash, maize, the teosinte, the antecedent of today's corn, beans, cotton, and in South America, potatoes, tomato, and so forth, all being domesticated fairly early, to the point that certainly by in central Mexico by 1500 BC, we have a lot of agriculture and agriculture-dependent communities. Classic example of these are the Olmec, of course, who are the antecedents of the other Mesoamerican cultures, Mayans, Aztecs, Toltecs. But we see already in this, this example of pottery from Nayarit, the multiple figures, the dwellings, the elevated dais with a temple on top, and another elevated group of people. So we're already by 500 BC in Central America talking about well-stratified societies, class societies with multiple elites, warriors, nobilities. We're talking about cities, large-scale ceremonial architecture, the first temple pyramids, hydraulic systems to manage water, complex calendars, human sacrifice, long-distance trade, and so forth. So this is a flourishing cultural region as early as, say, 800 to 800 BC. What we find in the late Archaic and early pre-colonial period, let's say from about 500 AD on, that local trade begins to expand into networks. And these networks are pretty extensive. One of the most, and for example, if you look at this small map in the center of the screen, all of these red lines represent known Indian trails in the southeastern part of the United States in the 17th century at the period of contact. So this is already a well-developed network of communication and trade. One of the most interesting finds was recently reported, and I mean very recently in American antiquity, was the presence of Venetian glass beads in Alaska that they had dated to sometime in the 15th century. Now, this would be absolutely remarkable if it were true, if they could verify it. It's still quite controversial. I mean, finding the beads is not controversial, that's without question, but the dating is controversial. There's a range of possible dates. But even so, it suggests, even if it were after, even if it were 16th century, the only way it could have gotten there would be through overland trade. So we know for a fact that there were established trade links here through the Aleutian Islands over the St. Lawrence Straits across the Bering Sea between the Far East and the interior of Alaska. We'll talk more about that later. This is a glyph drawn from the Florentine Codex of Pochtecas, which are Aztec regional traders who moved throughout the Southwest. The real question is what was traded. They did not have metal except for copper, and some copper was traded. They didn't pay attention to things like gold or silver. They traded shells and minerals, seeds, precious feathers, and so forth. Most importantly, I think they traded knowledge. They traded knowledge of agriculture, how to grow things, what to grow, where to plant them, technological knowledge, how to fashion certain arrowhead points. I shouldn't use the word arrowhead, I should just say points, because the bow and arrow, there's a lot of question about when, in fact, it was actually introduced into North America and whether or not it originated in several different places, more or less simultaneously, to meet a similar technological need. But in any case, what's in people's heads, what is much more important than the actual objects that they exchange and trade. So this trade networks, the emergence of agriculture, the growth of villages into cities leads us in the eastern part of North America to the emergence of the Mississippian culture. And the Mississippian cultural pattern is prehistoric to proto-historic. And there's fully developed agriculture, the so-called three sisters, corns, beans, and squash, plus tobacco, plus melons and other things. There's a fully developed town system, often palisaded towns. These towns had very sizable populations, well over 1,000 people. This was a stratified society. We know that that they had not only priesthood, but they had an aristocracy, they had hereditary leaders, and they created very complex political systems where towns would be united into confederacies and perhaps in something that looks a little bit like an empire. There was a matrilineal structure, and much of this looked like Mesoamerica. If you did not know, you would look at this and say, well, that's Aztec. Except this is a picture of Cahokia Mound in Mississippi, in Missouri and southern Illinois. And these mounds are all made out of dirt, not brick. So these are millions and millions of baskets of dirt piled high over years, many, many years. This was the largest earthen structure in the Western Hemisphere for as far as we know. So we find a lot of different groups here in the Northeast, familiar names like Pequot, Wampanoag, Mohegan. The Great Lakes tribes are Iroquoians and Algonquians, and then in the Ohio Valley, Shawnee and so forth, and then moving south into the Mississippi Valley, where we find the Chickasaw, Choctaw, Creek, and Cherokee. These are the almost direct descendants of and inheritors of this. I wouldn't say descendants. Descendants sounds like genetic, but they are certainly the cultural inheritors of the Mississippian culture. Village settlements, however, create a problem. Density of population meant that these folks were very much exposed to diseases brought about by contact with Europeans. And that contact begins fairly early with fishermen fishing from Spain and France and Portugal and England along the coast of Canada and Newfoundland and Maine. And then when we actually have settlers, then they're also bringing smallpox, measles, yellow fever, chickenpox, influenza. And with their animals come eventually things like anthrax. So we find a number of diseases that have a tremendous impact on people who have no immunity. And they are spread not only because people are living in concentrated populations, but they are communicating with each other along these trade networks. And this is true not only in North America, where we have what is called settler colonialism, where people come to actually settle and live, but in Central America and Mexico and in South America, where we have what we call resource exploitation colonialism, which people did not come originally to settle, but to take away the resources, similar to Siberia. So if we look here at the historical record for New England, we see references just in Massachusetts alone to a whole series of epidemics that are emptying whole villages of people in the 17th century. While the village culture of the inheritors of the Mississippian culture, while the village and densely populated regions of the East made a certain productivity and economic wealth possible, it also created the conditions for disease and depopulation. In the Southwest, the desert Southwest from northern Mexico to the southern part of the southwestern part of the United States, Arizona, New Mexico, we find people begin to live in pit houses. Here in Siberia, we know them as zemlyanka. This is very, very similar kinds of things in the first part of the current millennium. But by 750, 800, 900 AD, they are living above ground. They are making what are called unit pueblos, from the Spanish word pueblo, meaning village. And very quickly, within 200-300 years, these pueblos, these unit pueblos, are joining together and creating very, very large structures with large ceremonial structures called tivas. And I would point out to you the beautiful, this is all dry laid stonework. That is, there's no masonry, there's no cement or mud or mortar in between these, built in between these stones. So these are fantastic cities linked together by networks of roads and trails throughout the Southwest. The biggest of them all, in Chaco Canyon, New Mexico, was 5 stories tall on its back wall. It had more than 650 rooms, and until 1888, it was the largest single building in the United States. And yet, this building structure, virtually none of the rooms were living quarters. We know that because there are no fire pits anywhere. There's no residue from eating or cooking. So what was this place for? It seems that it was probably a ritual center, a very important ritual center. In the middle of a valley, this long valley here, in which there were many such ritual centers. And Chaco Canyon then suddenly, this suddenly collapses. It's abandoned. People move away. And no one really quite knows what happened. Did the central authority that was holding all of these small communities collapse? Why did it collapse? There's no evidence of outside aggression of warfare here. There's no burning of structures. So why did it collapse? The biggest, I should say the current argument, is that, and maybe the most persuasive one, is that a drought, extreme period of dryness that came into this region put real pressure on the outlying communities that were linked to this center community by supplying them with corn and food. And so the failure to adequately feed and distribute food in this community led to the collapse of the social organization. And what we do know, and we can trace it by archaeological exponents, is that the people who lived in Chaco Canyon moved out from Chaco Canyon into other areas, into the Hopi in northern Arizona and into the northern Pueblos, and even into southern Colorado, where they created these cliff-dwelling homes. And then that period ends very, very quickly. I mean, it's almost to see these magnificent structures and to realize that people built them from nothing, occupied them, and then left them and abandoned them all within the space of 200 years is very, very difficult to accept, but that's the archaeological evidence. So something very extraordinary happened, and it seems to be a matter of ecological pressure, forcing people to move back into smaller and smaller groups, into more remote areas to sustain themselves. So these archaeological cultures move out of the Chaco region, move out of these larger settlements in northern Mexico, and become the different village Indians throughout the Southwest, from the Hopi to the Zuni to the Acculturation Pueblos. What about the other Southwestern Indians everybody knows about, the Apache and the Navajo? Well, they are not native to the Southwest. They come to the Southwest probably somewhere around 1400, just before the Spanish arrive. When the Spanish arrive, the Spanish come and begin to subjugate the Pueblos. And when the Pueblo Indians flee into the mountains, the Apaches and Navajos are there. Apache and Navajo become local variants of the northern Athabascan culture. And this northern Athabascan culture, which by the way was a mountain culture, looked a lot like, for instance, our Mansi or Kamini Tunguski Evenk culture, taiga culture. These are taiga cultures, but they come into the desert Southwest over not a very long time of migration, probably a couple of hundred years of migration to come to the desert Southwest and learn how to adapt to the desert Southwest from the local village Indians who have 1,000 years of survival history. If we look in the far north, in Canada, we see the impact of the fur trade, not only the French and the British, but also the Russians. And it's an intercontinental trade. So these are taiga hunters and taiga foragers, who up until the advent of the colonial powers basically lived on hunting los, and alén, and fishing, and and we're not terribly interested, by the way, in furs except to clothe themselves. But this becomes a trade item, and as it becomes a trade item, and as that trade item creates a new way of thinking about our relationship to the environment, so that the environment becomes something that has things we can sell and trade, then that has an impact upon how people think about their land. And the creation, the first time we can think about individual families claiming hunting territories as their own. In addition, this way of thinking about animals and this way of thinking about land changes their way of thinking about religion, their belief system, and also the emergence of middlemen, people who you sell your furs to, who then sell it on to the traders, creates a different kind of social organization, which is a status organization, very different from the traditional one. There's also evidence of a good deal of intermarriage between Europeans and Native Americans in this northern region. So the fur trade had a huge impact, not just coming from the east with the French and the British and the Hudson Bay Company, but even from Siberia through Chukotka and into the interior of Alaska. We have records of Alaskan furs being traded to Chukchis, who then trade them on to Russians at places like Andew Wiget, so forth, in the middle of the 18th century. The Northwest Coast was a very rich area. These people did not have agriculture, but they had an abundance of meat and protein resources, not only from whaling and fishing and salmon, but also from moose and bear and mountain sheep. And they built a very powerful and strong culture based on maritime resources. They too were greatly influenced by the Russians through the Russian-American company, through intermarriage, and through conversion. Let me go back there just a minute to the previous slide, because I wanted to point out something that there is fairly good evidence that that some of the elements of Northwest Coast culture, like the use of slat armor, wooden hats, and so forth, some of the ornamentation, is part of a general North Pacific regional exchange, probably through the Aleutians, and that this might go back, not only go back before contact, but this North Pacific exchange might have persisted long after contact as well. Now let's talk about everybody's favorite Indians, the Plains Indians. And if I may just point out to you through a series of maps a couple of things. First of all, at the earliest level, you'll notice that the plains are relatively empty. This is between the Rocky Mountains and the Mississippi River Valley. These plains are empty. Nobody's really living there, and the archaeological record is pretty clear about this. But what happens is that Indian peoples living in what is the Ohio River Valley and along the Great Lakes moved out onto the plains seasonally and eventually relatively permanently in search of buffalo. If you look at this map down here, you can see that in 1795, we had buffalo as far east as Pennsylvania. Buffalo were even as far south as northern Mexico in the 1820s and 1830s. This is dark area is where they are in the second half the 19th century as the area shrinks. So buffalo are everywhere. And as settlement occurs, people are moving westward. Indians are moving westward in search of the buffalo. They live in earth lodges, not in teepees, and they exploit the margins between the wooded birch and maple and forests of the northeast and the tall grass prairies here where the buffaloes of the river basins. But by the 17th and 18th century, we see something quite different. We see that these Indian peoples are being pushed out onto the plains. They're being pushed out by warfare as these Eastern tribes come in contact with the European powers, the French and the English. And there's a kind of domino effect where one pushes another, pushes another, pushes another, pushes another. And they're being pushed by war, but they're also being drawn by horses, by the availability of horses and guns. And you can see the Cheyenne migrations are very, very typical. There's very good archaeological evidence that the Cheyenne Indians, who are, one of, along with the Lakota Sioux, one of the kind of archetypal Plains Indians, horse culture warriors, actually originated in the woodlands of Wisconsin. And we can follow their archaeological trail out onto the plains. The same thing goes for the Kiowa and for the Comanche. So there's archaeological evidence for all of this displacement. And that's because we see guns being traded from the Northeast, acquired through fur trade and through treaty negotiations from Northeastern tribes in exchange for horses coming from the South and the West. So that by 1750, guns from the East and horses from the West have created this new cultural formation on the plains, which we identify as the Plains horse culture. But it should be pointed out that horses were a mixed blessing because they also disrupted subsistence economies and they wrecked the grassland and the bison ecologies. They created social inequalities. They really did a number of things to significantly alter native ways of life. So as we come in looking at the colonial period and the impacts of colonization, this is a very important comparison. So most especially we see here in North America very early on, and large scale and long distance relocation, settlement colonialism as opposed to resource exploitation colonialism. We see intensive cultural pressures in North America, but very late and very limited cultural pressures in Siberia and so forth. Let's look at the differences and how those emerged in the 19th and 20th centuries. The US Constitution followed a very, very different pattern than, say, Russia or other colonial powers, including Spain. The US Constitution adopted the British precedent of recognizing tribes as distinctive self-governing nations. Therefore, tribes were subject to government-to-government relationship, and only the federal government could engage in formal relations with Indians. The federal government took upon itself the obligation to honor its treaty obligations in the future. It also recognized that since tribes were self-governing nations, they were the original owners of the land, so to speak. And so any land taking had to be done with their agreement. Let's move on. This is very, very different perspective. I have to insist on this between the British inheritance and Spain, France, Russia, and other colonial powers. The United States Indian policy went through several different periods. So following that British notion of making treaties with Indians, for at least the first 100 years or so, the United States made treaties with Indians. But then Congress banned treaty making in 1871, and a new era set about to assimilate Indians, to make them fit in to white European culture, to be in less Indian. This changed radically in 1930s with the New Deal of Franklin Roosevelt's administration, which shifted to establishing tribal governments and strengthening sovereignty. But there was a swing back in the 1950s as the government shifted policy radically and tried to end its relationship with Indians. That turned out to be disastrous and ineffective. And so finally, in the 1970s, the US government embarked upon a program of self-determination to guarantee tribes sovereignty and some control over their own future. Let's look at the treaty era. Very, very briefly, it's about removing Indians from the southeast and from the eastern part of the United States, making way for Euro-American settlers, putting them into some place, some specially reserved territory. It starts out being Indian territory, but shrinks very much. We're always taking land away from the Indians in order to provide more land for Euro-American settlement. This is a map, for instance, of the state of South Dakota today, an outline map of the state of South Dakota, all of which was, of course, Indian land. But through a series of successive land takings and treaties, the only Indian land left today is what is in blue. And that is actually, for one state, that's a significant amount of land. But understand that altogether it's probably less than 10% of the total land area. After the Civil War, the United States government felt itself unchallenged militarily, having subjected the Confederacy to surrender, and thought that it did not, and having militarized and created forts throughout the whole Western United States, felt that it no longer had to make agreements with Indian tribes. Indian tribes should do just what the government wanted them to do. It was very much a take it or leave it situation. The first major attempt, I mean, the idea behind all of this was to bring Indians into the modern world. Let's use all the comforting slogans. Civilize the Indians, educate them, bring them into the modern world. What did it mean in fact, and how was it done? The first thing that was done was to begin by taking away the land. The idea was these Indian peoples occupied land communally. They never had private property. They never even considered that they owned the land. They were using the land. Well, they use a lot of land. So let's tie them down to a specific piece of land. Now, okay, so then we had a reservation, but you saw what happened in South Dakota. Little by little, the reservations got smaller and smaller. Not only did they get smaller, but the Allotment Act said, look, let's make Indians like all people in the United States. Let's give them a piece of land, and that will be theirs. That family will have that land. So the Dawes General Allotment Act of 1887 said, we're going to give every family who is registered. So first of all, we have to make a list of all the families. And we're going to identify them by their grandparents. We have so many grandparents, then you are an official member. Oh. Now all of a sudden we're looking at how much blood people have at a certain time. And then we're going to give them land. Well, it always turns out that there is land left over. And some people get very small pieces of land. And then there's land left over. The government said, okay, well, we can sell all this land and we'll put the money in the bank, the government bank for the Indians to use later. We'll get back to that story in a bit. But the whole point here was if you can break up communal land, You can break up the notion of a tribe. Everybody's going to be an individual, just like in the United States. Then we're going to convert them to Christianity. We're going to make them farmers. We're going to send them to compulsory boarding school, internet. People were forcibly removed from their homes and put in boarding schools. I mean, forcibly. And the result was to take somebody like Tom Torlino, who was an Apache, and going to boarding school looking like this, come out looking like this, and they would say, wow, that's progress. In fact, what it meant was the loss of land, the decline of the population, depression, listlessness, lack of ambition, a sense that life is hopeless. The New Deal era of Roosevelt tried to change all of that. American Indians were at their lowest point in history, less than 2 million population, and almost all unemployed with no serious work and nothing to do except wait to die. I hate to put it so dramatically, but that's pretty much where it was. There were organizations formed to try by Indians to try to advance their interests, and they worked on the government. And when Roosevelt came to power, one of the first things that he did was push through the Indian Reorganization Act. It stopped the whole process of allotment and enabled the Secretary of the Interior, because Indians were now in the Department of the Interior, under the authority of the Interior Department, to buy land, to enlarge Indian reservations, but most importantly, it gave Indian tribes the right to organize their own governments for their common welfare. So they could have tribal governments that had a constitution, a written charter, which had to follow the form of the US Constitution, which meant separation of the legislative, executive, and judicial branches. It also meant voting, and also meant universal suffrage. Women could vote as well as men. Many tribes didn't like that particular part, not because it encouraged women, but because many tribes were already matrilineal and matriarchal, and women had significant power. So the alternative was to create a tribal corporate charter instead of a constitution, and those things were also done. So tribes begin to organize, they begin to have self-government, and to begin to chart their own future. But after the war, after the Second World War, Congress adopted the official policy of termination to try to get rid of its relationships with Indians. Part of that, the idea was that, again, this is another push to acculturate them, to force them out of the Indian way of life. And part of that was a relocation program to attract Indians to cities where there was a need for work and labor in the post-war economic boom. A lot of Indians did go to the cities, and today more than half of America's Indians live in cities, some for the third generation. But in 1970, President Richard Nixon promoted the notion of self-determination for American Indians. And self-determination is a very powerful word. You can have a government, as many of these tribes did have after the Indian Reorganization Act, Roosevelt's administration pushed forward. Many of them did have governments, but those governments were often had any decision they made had to be approved by the Department of the Interior Bureau of Indian Affairs in Washington. So they were being treated like small children who could make some decisions, but could only do things if their white parents approved. The Self-Determination Act enabled the government to make direct contracts with Indian tribes, to say, instead of providing you with our health care, we will contract with you so that you can hire doctors, you can build hospitals, you can do those things. Instead of taking your children and putting them in our schools, we will pay you, take the same amount of money and give it to the tribe so that you can build your own schools and hire your own teachers. This was an enormous impulse to Indian tribes. They could now take control of many things themselves. Number of other activities were terribly important as well. The growth of tribal casinos. Everybody has heard about casinos, I think, as income streams. Remember, Indians are not hunting buffalo anymore. Indians are living impoverished on reservations. And so the idea of being able to control your own businesses and not have them being subject to state taxes was hugely important. Once they found out that they could create gambling tribal casinos on Indian reservations, those reservation casinos generated nearly 35 billion, like a milliard dollars in 2019. That's a lot of money. And that money went for schools, infrastructure, senior citizens programs, heritage and language programs, and so forth. A number of other activities included the laws included the American Indian Religious Freedom Act and the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. This one was especially important because it said that all federal agencies and museums must reach agreement with tribes on repatriation, that is, giving back to the tribes museum exponents, including physical remains, skeletal remains of individuals. That was a hugely important act. Today, here's this, for example, just take the Navajo Nation, which I said earlier has 175,000 people, has a budget of 1.2 billion US dollars. In 1996, 40% of the tribal budget came from the sale of its own natural resources. So the tribe benefits from its own proximity resources. But it's also important to point out that these industries are declining in value. They've closed this coal plant, for instance, this energy plant. These industries consume water, and they have huge environmental health outcomes. So that even though they control these things, they also, you have these resources, but you also have all the problems that go with them. There are today in the United States 36 tribal colleges and universities that offer 2-year degrees. 11 offer bachelor's degrees and 5 offer master's degrees. And all of these are certified programs. The same thing is true with Indian public schools. So the Zuni reservation that I worked with has their own school system, but they have to meet state standards. All of these tribal colleges and universities have to meet degree standards by the U.S. Higher Education Consortium. Alaska is different. Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act, instead of setting up reservations, set up regional corporations. These corporations lease or sell natural resources. The corporation's board of directors is elected by all of the eligible residents, native residents within a particular area. And within that particular area, the only land that can be equivalent to a reservation is something like a village, very, very small. Though they have control of the resources in this area, the actual land that they hold for sure is the village land. There were a lot of unsettled claims after World War II. Congress passed several laws that enabled tribes to sue the federal government. The first was an Indian Claims Commission that said many treaties did not give us the full value of the lands that we used. So we could sue the US government for that. Then to get full value. Then we could get compensation because the US government failed in its responsibility to take care of Indian land. Or remember I told you about allotment and the sale of Indian lands and went into the government bank. Well, it turns out that that bank, that government fund was quote lost, unquote. And when Congress found out about that mismanagement, they enabled the tribes to sue the federal government for that. And about $3.5 billion was allocated as compensation. Canada is different than the United States in this respect, and I'll almost finish up here to say that in Canada, they went through a series of large area treaties. These are the numbered treaties in pink, covering this whole area. And these treaties were not made with individual tribes, but with all the people within a region. In exchange for that, people got some cash. They were allowed to keep their village land, and they were promised the right to hunt and fish on all the land that they gave up that was not used for settling, lumber, or mining. Well, guess what? That doesn't leave much. So in Canada, most of the actual reserved land is very, very small, the size of a village. If you compare Canadian reserves to American reserves, remember we were just looking at South Dakota. Here's the Rosebud Sioux Indian Reservation, which is relatively decent size, 5,000 square kilometers. The Acoma Pueblo Reservation is very, very small in here, and New Mexico is only 1,600 square kilometers. But the second largest reserve in Canada is the Siksika Reserve in Alberta, and that's less than 700 square kilometers, and that's the second largest. So all these red dots are reserves, but they're very, very small. The rest of the land is made available for Indians, for other uses. This is changing. Canada also is going through a land claim settlement final agreement in different areas. And they have created a brand new territory, entirely self-governed by Inuit, called Nunavut, this whole large territory here. And it has its own particular issues, including global warming and cultural preservation. Indian resistance in the United States and Canada has gone public and has been very important in pressuring, always in pressuring the US government to recognize, not to get anything new, never is it about getting anything new. It's about making sure that the government lives up to what it promised in the first place. And that's true in the United States, and it's also true in Canada. We also see, since 1970, we've seen a really renewal of American Indian culture in new forms that include everything from fiction. Scott Momaday's Housemaid of Dawn won the Pulitzer Prize for the best novel of the year. Films, movies, even video games, art. All of these things are taking on new forms in which old traditions are united with new forms. Let me just give you one example, and this will be very, very brief, but I think you might find this a little bit entertaining. That was Star Wars in Navajo. Finding Nemo has also been translated into Navajo. So, Indian people are using contemporary Western forms and adapting them to their cultural values and ideals. But there are problems. This is the coal sands mining in Canada. The pipeline issues are huge, protecting water. COVID is hitting the Navajo reservation and many other reservations extremely hard. Missing and murdered indigenous women is a big issue. More than 9,000 indigenous women in Canada and the US are missing. Many of them are found murdered and sexually violated. Language and cultural preservation is an ongoing issue. And again, they are adapting things like using contemporary forms, in this case, a digital atlas, where clicking on a site will link you to a story and all in the native language. And we do, they do have their heroes. There are Native American astronauts. You might have heard that NASA has landed an exploring robot on the moon. A Navajo was deeply involved in one of those in that project. And many of the features on Mars now have Navajo names. And you might have heard that in the current administration of President Biden, the new Secretary of Interior, Deborah Haaland, is a Laguna Pueblo Indian woman. So 170 years after this white supremacist was named Interior Secretary and vowed to get rid of all Native Americans, we have a Native American woman as Secretary of the Interior. I'll leave it at that and take any questions that you have if you're not asleep. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, we are open for your questions. Please turn on your camera. It's good to see face. And we are ready to hear your questions. Maybe for the beginning, Professor Wiget, would you please explain linguistic aspects of Indians? What was the situation before colonization, during colonization, and now about language?
Well, before colonization is very, very difficult to say, right? Because we don't have any written records. But we know from first contact period, what we call the proto-historic period, the period on just before and just after first contact, that many Indian peoples were at least bilingual in terms of 2 or more native languages. That was not at all uncommon. There were, well, I have to back up a little bit and say something else, which is that historically, linguists of Native American languages, American linguists of Native American languages are much more conservative in terms of discriminating different languages or assigning languages to language families than European linguists, especially Russian linguists who are come out of the school of the Nostratic theory, very much interested in large macro families. But it's easy enough to say that there are probably well over 200 discrete languages in native North America. That's the United States and Canada, and not counting Mesoamerica or South America. Well over 200 discrete languages at the time of contact. Language loss today is a very, very big issue. I think that there are, a lot of it depends on, as it does almost everywhere, on community cohesion and having a sufficient number and density of population of speakers in order to sustain the language. So if we look at some places, like the Pueblos in the Southwest, which are village Indians, we have good language retention. If we look at some places that are very isolated, like the Navajo, we have good language retention. On the other hand, if you look at those communities that have been affected by urbanization or by relocation, not very good with repatriation. So it's a serious, the situation varies as one would expect because it's a very large area and a large number of languages. But that's roughly the situation.
Thank you. And you have one more question on a chat from Alexander Kuzmenko. Can you read this question? You can click, yeah, and it's in English. You can.
Yes, I have. Is there any information on the rituals of Indians associated with the entry into occupied territory into captured cities? That's an interesting question. Thank you, Alexander. As far as I know, no. Now I have to be very, very careful and say that I don't know a lot. As much as I know what I don't know, and that's a lot. Indians generally, at least in North America, did not capture territory. Can I put it that way? They did not capture territory. They, from time to time, occupied different areas in order to exploit those resources. And so they might have fought with people over resources, but they didn't occupy territory. They didn't plant flags. They didn't define boundaries for the sake of boundaries. And of course, they didn't really have cities to capture and enter into. They did have settlements, but even in the palisaded cities, as far as I know, in the east, Cherokee towns in the south, I don't think that there were any kind of celebratory rituals, conquest rituals.
Thank you very much. And you have one more question on the chat. Do we have any questions?
Did Indians have their own coins or money before colonization, or they used only some goods? Again, that depends on who you're talking about and which Indians that you're talking about. But in some places, hello?
Yeah, go ahead. Sorry for that.
That's okay. In some places, it seems that shells might have been used in trade, but mostly this is a kind of bartering system. Even when we talk about fairly advanced trade, say for instance in the 13th, 14th century, when we talk about Aztec traders in northern Mexico, it's a kind of bartering system. So no coinage for sure, because they didn't have any metalwork at all.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, more questions?
Oh, yep. I have one.
Yes.
Thanks a lot for your very interesting lecture. And my question is about the religious situation among Indians. You mentioned that they were Christianized during the colonization era, but what about the contemporary trends? Are they keeping their local beliefs? What do you know about, or could you say about these pan-Indian trends in religious systems of American
Yes.
Indians?
Thank you for that. Thank you for that question. When I talked about Christianization, I was talking really about a government program to Christianize, and that program in fact existed. Now, if the government wants to try to do something, that's one thing. Whether or not the government succeeds in effectively Christianizing, that's a different thing. I can tell you from my own experience that I know that quite a few Indians managed to be effectively both. Okay, it doesn't matter to them. You know, part of their heritage is, so for instance, I worked in the Southwest mostly, in the Pueblos. And so the Pueblos historically were always Christianized by the Catholic priests. So Pueblos had Catholic churches. Every Pueblo had a Catholic church. Indians today still go to these Catholic churches. Their parents went to these Catholic churches. Their grandparents went to these Catholic churches. They've been Catholic for ages. Just like you can find people in Alaska who've been Pravoslavny for ages, okay? Native people. But at the same time, they quite effectively maintain their traditional belief. They do not see these things as necessarily competing. It depends on how they understand the relationship between the two. They might see them as the way in which somebody who is bilingual thinks about communication. I've got two ways of communicating, right? This way or that way. I can speak in French or I can speak in Spanish. I can be Catholic or I can be Zuni. Okay. On the other hand, there is one thing that's very, very real, and that is that whether it's Protestant or Catholic, the emphasis in religion, in Western religion, is almost entirely on two things: the individual, an individual conversion or belief or whatever, an individual investment you have to make. And the second thing is that it's portable. That is, if you're in a Catholic church in New Mexico and a Catholic church in New York and a Catholic church in France, the language may be different, but you understand what you're doing everywhere. If you're in a Pravoslavny church in Brooklyn, a Pravoslavny church in Alaska, and a Pravoslavny church in Moscow, you understand what's going on. That's because God is out there. For Native Americans and for indigenous people everywhere, religion is always very much local. It's rooted in a particular piece of land. And so in my work with Hanti, for instance, where Baptists have been very active, many of them are quite adamant that you cannot be both Baptist and Hanti, because once you give up the gods who protect this particular land, then you're not Hanti anymore. Okay? So it depends on where you are. Everything is specific to a situation. But that's the big generalization that I would make about individualism and portability, carrying it everywhere.
Thank you.
Thank you. More questions?
Yes, I have a question. Oh, Vasilisa, you have another question? No?
Yes. But you first, sir. You were waiting already.
Roman, go ahead, then Vasilisa.
Yes, of course. Dear Andrew, special thanks for describing problems and challenges that the Native Americans are facing. But I have a very simple question. You mentioned, you quoted our eminent biologist, Nikolai Vavilov.
Mm-hmm.
And what are the most promising interdisciplinary approaches in the framework of our anthropological American studies from your point of view? Thank you.
I think one of the things that's happening right now in the United States and to some degree in Canada, several things. Probably the most important is that there is now an emphasis in North America on what we would call, what is called applied anthropology. That is, the more abstract ethnological questions are of less interest. Not that they're not interested, but they are of less interest than how to actually address some specific issues, say, for instance, language preservation or health. So that's one thing. The second thing is that one of the reasons that is so, one of the reasons why there's more interest in applied anthropology than in the more abstract issues, is that since the Indian Claims Commission was set up in 1948, which required anthropologists, which required tribes to work with anthropologists to establish some things, that there has grown up a cadre, let's use Russian language, a kind of cadre of very trained, well-trained native professionals in everything from biology to archaeology. And basically they are taking back this work. So it becomes less and less an issue in which European or American and Euro-American anthropologists describe indigenous people, and more a situation where indigenous people represent themselves in science. I'd say the biggest areas today have to do with things like traditional environmental knowledge and the way traditional environmental knowledge affects planning for land use or other kinds of issues. So that, you know, one of the current issues right now in Russia is ethnological expertise. Well, the question is, how do you do that? And that's the kind of stuff that is very, very important in the United States. So the relationship between traditional environmental knowledge, which requires cooperation between anthropologists and folklorists and native people to understand what that is, and then how that gets transferred into planning, project planning. That's another, that's a big issue. Land is always a big issue. Water is a big issue. Healthcare and the distribution of government services. All these are big issues. So these are not, and they're not abstract issues. They're very, very concrete and specific kinds of things. I'm not sure that I answered your question, Roman. Maybe if I didn't, you could help me understand it better. That's what I see are the big issues right now. There is no kind of larger all the issues that are abstract, such as what is called the ontological term in anthropology or multi-species ethnography, which both of which are in my area of interest, are related to very, very concrete things having to do with land use management, resource management, how we relate to animals. So,
Thank you. So I have Vasilis in my list. Do we have more questions? So Vasilisa is your final question for tonight, please.
I was just interested, some time ago, I had read some articles about how Native Americans who lived in the coast, I believe it was closer to Canada, had used like their native agricultural practices of clam farming to create a sort of sustainable food source for themselves. And then later I was aware that in Canada, there were some problems between native use of, let's say, I believe it was lobster fishing versus like more corporate lobster fisheries in the area. And I just wanted your opinion. Do you think that native ways of helping to preserve food systems and ecodiversity, do you think they can be applied to useful policy, or do you feel like they can sometimes be maybe co-opted for exploitation, or your own unique opinion on this?
That's a really, really smart question. Thank you, Vasilis. That's a very smart question, because I think it's very easy to imagine, again, going back to the rector's opening remarks, it's very easy to imagine a stereotypical Native American who always is concerned about the environment and so on and so forth. And we know from the fact that indigenous people are not automatically conservationists or careful with the environment. We know that for not only archaeologically, in fact, but even contemporarily. So over-harvesting of species is not unknown among Native people. But your question is whether or not, so if I understand your question, it's whether or not such knowledge, traditional knowledge, could be useful in planning some kind of conservation regime, and the answer is yes. I can give you some very, very good examples in the Northwest Coast, for instance, among the Haisla people and the Hudson people in Canada. If you want, my email is there. If you contact me by email, I'll give you some references to that. And you're right about the lobster fishing. This is in the Atlantic coast of Canada, in Newfoundland, and where that's a big issue. The question is whether it can be co-opted. Also, the second question, whether it can be co-opted. And I think, yes, it can be co-opted easily enough. Whether it has been, I don't know. But certainly, I mean, you can always manipulate that image of the Indian as a conservationist for political purposes, for political and economic purposes, right? So it's easy to do. Yeah.
Thank you.
Sure, thank you.
Okay.
Send me an email so that I can, Vasilisa, send me an email so I can send you those references.
Thank you, of course.
Okay.
Ladies and gentlemen, one more question.
Yes, I want to ask, or maybe it would be on my remark. Professor Wiget, I am very grateful to you, of course, and for your comprehensive lecture on Indians of Northern America. And my remark is on the position that Constitution of United States established the practice of concluding treaties. To my knowledge, the only mentioning of Indians in the Constitution of United States is about Indians not paying taxes. And the practice of establishing treaties was connected with Northeastern Ordinance of 1787, which was established a little earlier than United States Constitution was adopted, and then by several laws of United States Congress. You remember that in 1871, when that practice was terminated, it was not required any amendment to United States Constitution.
Right.
It was abolished simply by law.
Right. Right. Absolutely correct. It's Article 1, Section 9 of the Constitution in the Commerce Clause that gives the federal government the exclusive right to treat with Indians. Paying taxes, Indians don't pay taxes on land, on their reservation land, but they do pay individual income tax if they have income, and of course they pay business tax if they own a business that is not on Indian land. So the taxing thing is sometimes misunderstood. But thank you for that. Yeah.
Okay, once again,
Mikhail, I have one question here from
sure.
Konstantina Shrafian in the chat box. I don't know if you wanted me to answer that.
Oh, yeah. You have from Konstantin, yeah.
About universities in Canada and tribes that connected with. Again, I can, Constantine, if you would contact me by email, I can give you very specific information about universities. The tribes of the United States Indians that I've worked with personally are in the Southwest Navajo, Apache, Zuni, and I did some field work in Canada among the Cree Indians of Northern Quebec. That was long ago, but the Zuni is relatively recent. That's my dissertation work and a lot of work afterwards in the 80s with Zuni. So, but as for the statistics, those statistics are all publicly available. Census data, the National Congress of American Indians all publish that. Statistics are all widely available. Okay. I guess that takes care of it.
Okay, yeah, I think that's it. Do you have any final questions or comments? Oh, we have thank you from Konstantin. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to thank everybody, all participants, and those who were just listening, and colleagues who were asking questions. And once again, thank you to Artem Maslov and colleagues from Institute of Ethnology and Anthropology. And once again, Professor Andew Wiget, it was a great pleasure to have you as a key speaker tonight. And we hope to continue our project. We can find, we have already found this project very useful and fruitful, and we have a good comments from students and scholars from different universities. Once again, thank you everybody for participation. And Professor Wiget, be safe, and we wish you all the best from snow in Russia. Still, we have a lot of snow, even it's end of spring. Beginning of spring.
Because I'm in Moscow, and
Yeah, in Moscow, good.
Yeah, I'm professor emeritus from New Mexico State, but последние 10 лет я постоянно живу в Москве.
Good. Okay, see you everybody once again. Hope in Nizhny Novgorod in real time and real life.
Thank you.
Bye.
Take care.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Be healthy.